Hello, this is Daniel Juster from Jerusalem. I'm continuing these clips on the nature of Torah as an introduction to the course we have in the Torah application for our times. And I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem at Restoration from Zion. That's the name of our ministry, Patty, myself, and my son. And we do a lot of things, so you can look up our website or at Tikkun TV, where we have our list of books, and we have the list of ministries, and also sign up for our newsletter and be connected to the things that we do in teaching, discipleship, raising leaders, planting and mentoring congregations. We do so many things, and I think you'll be blessed by being connected to us. I wanted to speak now about the new covenant and to give some clarity about that. In Jeremiah chapter 31 and Ezekiel chapter 36, we have the basic chapters about the new covenant. But there are other texts that also have new covenantal meaning, like Joel chapter 2:28 and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and many other texts that you'll feel are new covenantal. But in Jeremiah, he says, in 31:31, that the days are coming when he will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And it won't be like the covenant that he made when he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, but that the nature of the covenant that he's going to make is such that he's going to write his Torah upon them, write it on their heart. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No one will teach his neighbor, each his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. This is a personal, intimate relationship that everyone will have in Israel, because he says it's with Israel, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. I will forgive their iniquity. I will remember their sin no more. And then he goes on and he promises that the covenant with Israel will never cease, that he will never, Israel will always have offspring. And then the text goes on and it talks about the fact that the land is also going to be everlastingly promised to Israel. In Ezekiel, we read very parallel in chapter 36 that God's going to take Israel from the nations, and then he's going to change them. He's going to sprinkle clean water on them. He's going to give them a new heart. He's going to give them a new spirit. He's going to put his Holy Spirit in them, and he's going to move them to obey his statutes, ordinances, judgments. And of course, in the book of Hebrews, this is very strongly emphasized in chapters 8 through 10. So, this has caused people to think that we're not under the Mosaic covenant any longer. We're under the new covenant, and therefore the Mosaic writings are irrelevant. And that is an incredibly bad conclusion that many Christians and some teachers have come to, because it's as if they're not reading what Jeremiah and Ezekiel said. It is true in my theology that the new covenant does supersede, and as the covenant upon which we enter into relationship with God, it replaces the Mosaic covenant in that dimension. But the new covenant tells us in the very text what the problem was in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel, and it's brought out in the teachings of Paul in Romans chapter 6 through 8, and it's brought out in Hebrews, and that is the fact that there is a new covenant shows that God found fault with this covenant, and the fault was not in the covenant itself, but it was in its inability to enable people to do it. That there needed to be an outpouring of the Spirit and much greater grace. So the difference between the Mosaic covenant and the new covenant is not that the Mosaic covenant is a covenant with commandments and laws and the new covenant is a grace covenant without commandments and laws. That's very foolish to think, because if you just read the New Testament and you read the Hebrew Bible, you won't come out with that distinction. Because the New Covenant is full of commandments. There are over 1,000 commandments in the New Testament scriptures. And some of the commandments are repetitions of the commandments given to Moses that are repackaged in the New Covenant and repeated. So, what's going on here is that you have the Mosaic covenant as a covenant of grace, but now the new covenant is a covenant of greater grace. So it's just like the famous evangelist Charles Finney said, the new covenant enables us to do what the Mosaic covenant commanded, but didn't sufficiently empower for us to obey. So it's the empowerment to obedience. It's the power of the level of grace in the new covenant as to why the new covenant supersedes the Mosaic covenant. But what does he say about the new covenant? I will write my law on their hearts. And a lot of the law that's written on the heart, besides the law of love and the teaching of Yeshua, is the content that's in Moses. That's a lot of the law that fits the new covenant. Or in Ezekiel, I will move them to obey my statutes, ordinances, and judgments. Well, what are the statutes, ordinances, and judgments that Ezekiel's referring to? He's referring to the stuff that was written in Moses. So, as we look at this, we in Tikkun, and we in our writings that I've mentioned, talk about a very important concept, and that is the applicability of the Mosaic law to the new covenant order. And I'll say that again. The applicability of the Mosaic writings, commandments, laws to the new covenant order. How do we make that applicability? Well, if you study each law, you usually can see what it's there for. You can usually see if it's universal, or if it's an accommodation to the weakness of those days, like slavery or polygamy. And you can trace that area of law through the prophets and through the teaching of Yeshua and the apostles, and you can get a pretty idea of applicability. And so Messianic Judaism is a orientation toward life and theology that believes in the applicability of the law, not only the universal moral commandments or civil laws that can be applied to nations, but also believes in the applicability of the patterns of life that are given to the Jewish people that are not limited to being connected to temple services and sacrifices and the priesthood. A lot of what's in Moses that has to do with the Jewish pattern of life can be practiced without a temple. And so we talk about applicability. Now it's interesting, only 238 laws are applicable without the temple of the 613. So when we talk about applicability, we're usually talking about that 238, as you'll find in our larger book. So that's going to lead us to just making some comments in the next clips on that applicability, and we'll give some examples.